The crimson sun blazed across the Pacific horizon as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. It was June 3rd, 1942, and the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy cut through the waters toward Midway Atoll with the precision of a katana blade. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese war machine seemed unstoppable. Nagumo's eyes swept across the formation surrounding his flagship. The carriers Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu moved in perfect synchronization, their flight decks bristling with Mitsubishi Zero fighters and Aichi dive bombers. This was the Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier striking force the world had ever seen. In the preceding months, these same ships had carved a path of destruction across the Pacific. From the Dutch East Indies to the Indian Ocean, their aircraft raining death upon Allied forces with surgical precision. The plan, conceived by the brilliant Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was elegant in its simplicity. Operation MI would draw out the remaining American Pacific Fleet by threatening Midway, the strategic outpost that guarded the approaches to Hawaii. Once the Americans committed their forces, the superior Japanese fleet would annihilate them, in a decisive battle forcing the United States to sue for peace. It was a strategy born from centuries of samurai tradition. Strike swiftly, strike decisively, and victory would follow. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the air group leader who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, studied his charts in the ready room, below decks. The same tactical advantages that had served Japan so well remained firmly in their grasp. Their pilots were veterans of the China War, hardened by years of combat experience that their American counterparts lacked. The Zero fighter remained superior to anything the Americans could field, its incredible range and maneuverability making it the terror of Pacific skies. As reported in the June 1942 edition of the New York Times, American naval strength in the Pacific had been crippled by the Pearl Harbor attack, leaving only a handful of carriers to defend the vast ocean. The Japanese High Command believed they faced a demoralized and inferior enemy, one that would crumble under the weight of their tactical superiority. The intelligence reports seemed to confirm their confidence. American forces at Midway appeared. Minimal, perhaps 24 aircraft defending the tiny coral atoll. Reconnaissance flights had detected no major fleet movements, suggesting the Americans remained unaware of the approaching storm. Vice Admiral William Halsey, their most aggressive commander, was reportedly hospitalized with a skin condition, removing a key tactical mind from the American side. Below decks, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga briefed his pilots on the upcoming mission. The attack on Midway would commence at dawn on June 4th, with 108 aircraft launching in the first wave. They would suppress the American air defenses, destroy the runway facilities, and prepare the way for the invasion force. Following behind, it was a routine operation, no different from dozens they had executed flawlessly across the Pacific. As night fell across the task force, the Japanese sailors settled into their bunks with the quiet confidence of professionals preparing for another victory. The tactical edge that had brought them triumph after triumph remained sharp and ready. Their aircraft were superior, their pilots more experienced, their ships faster and more heavily armed than anything the Americans possessed. None of them could have imagined that hundreds of miles away, American code breakers had already torn apart their most secret communications, laying bare every detail of Operation MI to enemy eyes. The basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over stacks of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions, his eyes burning from days of relentless work. The cryptanalysts of Station Hypo had achieved what many thought impossible. They had cracked the Japanese Navy's most secure operational code, JN-25. Through weeks of painstaking analysis, pattern recognition, and brilliant deduction, they had assembled a nearly complete picture of Japanese intentions. The breakthrough had come when Rochefort's team identified the target designation, AF, in multiple intercepted messages. By orchestrating a clever deception, having Midway transmit a false water shortage report in plain text, they confirmed that AF was indeed Midway Atoll. The Japanese had unknowingly revealed not just their target, but their entire order of battle, timing, and approach routes. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, studied the intelligence reports with the calm demeanor that had earned him respect throughout the Navy. The Japanese planned to strike Midway on June 4, 1942, with 4 fleet carriers and supporting vessels. It was exactly the opportunity American forces had been waiting for, a chance to engage the enemy on terms of their own choosing, with full knowledge of Japanese intentions. Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, was already at sea, having departed Pearl Harbor on May 28th. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, screened by cruisers and destroyers, took position northeast of Midway, carefully avoiding Japanese reconnaissance flights. Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher aboard the Yorktown, would join them despite the carrier's hasty repairs following the Battle of the Coral Sea. The American force was outnumbered, but possessed 2 crucial advantages that Yamamoto's planners had failed to consider. First, they knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. Second, they had positioned their forces to attack from an unexpected direction while the enemy focused on Midway. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's recent bombing raid on Japan, launched from the carrier Hornet in April, had already demonstrated American resolve and capability. As documented in contemporary military records, the psychological impact of that mission had forced Japanese commanders to reconsider their assumptions about American fighting spirit and tactical innovation. At Midway itself, Marine Corps aviators prepared their meager force of fighters and dive bombers. Major Lofton Henderson commanded Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, equipped with obsolete Vindicator dive bombers that the pilots had nicknamed Wind Indicators for their poor performance. Despite their inferior equipment, the Marines understood their role in the coming battle. They would absorb the first Japanese attack and inflict whatever damage they could. Captain Richard Fleming briefed his pilots on their desperate mission. They would launch everything they had against the Japanese carriers, knowing full well that many would not return. Their sacrifice would buy precious time for the Navy's strike aircraft to locate and attack the enemy fleet. It was a grim calculus, but one that every man accepted without hesitation. The radar station on Midway, one of the few operational sets in the Pacific, swept the empty skies continuously. Operators had been briefed to expect the first Japanese aircraft shortly after dawn on June 4th. Unlike previous Pacific battles, the Americans would not be caught by surprise. As the sun set on June 3rd, the trap was set. Japanese confidence in their tactical superiority remained unshaken, their pilots sleeping peacefully aboard their carriers as they approached what they believed would be another routine victory. The Americans waited in silence, their knowledge of enemy intentions providing the first real advantage they had possessed since the war began. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Dawn broke gray and overcast on June 4th. 1942, as the Japanese 1st Carrier Striking Force reached its launch position 240 miles northwest of Midway. At 4:30 in the morning, flight deck crews aboard the 4 carriers began the intricate ballet of preparing aircraft for combat. Mechanics performed final checks on engines, armorers loaded bombs and ammunition, and pilots gathered for their final briefings. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga climbed into his Nakajima B-5N bomber, adjusting his goggles as the engine roared to life. Around him, 107 other aircraft prepared for takeoff, 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 36 level bombers. The plan called for a systematic destruction of Midway's defenses, clearing the way for the invasion. force scheduled to arrive that afternoon. At 5:34, the first aircraft lifted off from the Akagi's deck, followed in rapid succession by planes from the other carriers. Within minutes, the entire strike force was airborne and forming up for the flight to Midway. Tomonaga led his formation south, through the morning sky, confident in the overwhelming firepower under his command. 2 hours earlier, at Midway's radar station, Privates Joseph McDonald and George Lipa had detected the approaching formation at a distance of 93 miles. The warning immediately flashed to Marine Air Group 22, where every available aircraft scrambled to meet the attack. 26 fighters, a mixture of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and a handful of newer Grumman Wildcats, climbed desperately to intercept the incoming bombers. Major Floyd Parks led the Marine fighters in their hopeless charge against the Japanese formation. The Buffaloes, nicknamed Flying Coffins by their pilots, were no match for the escorting Zeros. Within minutes of contact, 17 of the 26 Marine fighters had been shot down, their pilots' sacrifice buying only precious minutes for Midway's ground defenses. The Japanese bombers swept over the atoll at 6:20, their ordnance falling with practiced precision on the airfield, fuel tanks, and military installations. Tomonaga watched with satisfaction as explosions bloomed. Across the tiny island, smoke rising in black columns that marked successful hits. However, as he circled for a second pass, he noted with concern that the runway remained operational and several American aircraft were still taking off. On the ground, Marine anti-aircraft gunners poured fire into the sky, their tracers reaching up like deadly fingers toward the attacking aircraft. Sergeant Harold Thomason's battery scored hits on several bombers, watching with grim satisfaction as one Japanese plane spiraled down in flames. But the defenders were overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. Captain William Humbird led the remnants of the Marine fighters back into the fray, his Wildcat's guns chattering as he closed with a Japanese bomber. The enemy rear gunner's bullets shattered his windscreen, but Humbird pressed his attack until the bomber burst into flames. It was typical of the desperate courage displayed by Midway's defenders that morning. As recorded in official Marine Corps battle reports, the first wave attack lasted approximately 20 minutes, during which Japanese aircraft dropped their entire bomb load on the atoll's facilities. When Tomonaga finally led his formation back toward the carriers, he transmitted the message that would prove fateful. There is need for a second attack. The damage assessment revealed the limits of the Japanese strike. While hangars burned and fuel tanks exploded, the critical runway remained operational. American aircraft continued to launch, and radar installations continued to function. Most critically, Midway's striking power, its land-based bombers, had already departed to search for the Japanese fleet. Back on the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo received Tomonaga's message with growing concern. A second attack would delay his plans and require rearming aircraft currently equipped for anti-ship missions. As he wrestled with this tactical dilemma, he remained unaware that American scouts had already spotted his carriers and were racing back to report their position. The first phase of the battle had gone according to Japanese expectations, but cracks were beginning to appear in their operational plan. The trap was closing, though Nagumo did not yet realize he was the prey. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood in the flag bridge of the Akagi, his mind churning through the competing demands of tactical doctrine and operational reality. It was 7:15, on the morning of June 4th, and Lieutenant Tomonaga's request for a second attack on Midway had thrown his carefully orchestrated plan into chaos. The tactical manual was clear: neutralize enemy air power before proceeding with fleet operations. Yet something felt wrong about the morning's developments. The first disturbing news had arrived at 7:28 when Tone's No. 4 float plane reported sighting American ships to the northeast. Petty Officer First Class Amari Tone's message was frustratingly vague. Enemy ships, course 080, speed 20 knots. The pilot had failed to identify the composition of the formation, leaving Nagumo to wonder whether he faced destroyers or something far more dangerous. Chief of Staff Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka urged immediate action. "Admiral, we must assume enemy carriers are present and launch our attack aircraft immediately." The strike force currently aboard Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu had been armed with anti-ship ordnance since dawn, specifically prepared for such a contingency. 93 aircraft sat ready on the flight decks, their crews standing by for launch orders. But Nagumo hesitated, trapped between conflicting priorities. His returning Midway strike force, led by Tominaga himself, was running low on fuel and desperately needed to land. Several aircraft had battle damage that required immediate attention. Standard naval doctrine prohibited launching new strikes, while recovering aircraft, as the risk of deck collisions was too great. The decision that would haunt Nagumo for the rest of his life came at 7:45. He ordered the anti-ship weapons removed from his reserve aircraft and replaced with land attack ordnance for the second Midway strike. Armored crews began the laborious process of moving bombs and torpedoes below deck, unaware that they were signing death warrants for thousands of their shipmates. As detailed in post-war Japanese naval analyses, this rearmament decision violated fundamental carrier doctrine that demanded maintaining strike aircraft in instant readiness. The process would take at least 90 minutes to complete, during which the entire fleet remained vulnerable to air attack. At 8:09, the scout plane finally transmitted the message Nagumo dreaded. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. The trap had been sprung, but the Japanese admiral found himself powerless to respond immediately. His anti-ship aircraft were below deck being rearmed, while his returning Midway strike force circled overhead with fuel gauges approaching empty. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, was already airborne and closing on the Japanese fleet. His 15 Devastator torpedo bombers represented the cutting edge of American naval aviation, their pilots trained to press home attacks regardless of casualties. Behind them came dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown, their crews briefed on the exact position of the enemy carriers. The irony was not lost on Japanese naval historians who later analyzed the battle. The same tactical flexibility that had served Japan so well in previous engagements now worked against them. Their ability to rapidly reconfigure strike aircraft for different missions became a fatal vulnerability when time was their most precious commodity. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from appendicitis aboard the Akagi, watched the unfolding crisis with growing alarm. The Pearl Harbor strike commander understood better than most the delicate timing required for successful carrier operations. "We should have launched immediately upon sighting enemy ships," he later wrote in his memoirs. By 8:30, chaos reigned on the Japanese flight decks. Returning Midway aircraft landed among bombs and torpedoes scattered across the deck, their crews desperate to refuel and rearm for the next mission. Below deck, ordnance handlers worked frantically to complete the rearmament process, unaware that American dive bombers were already beginning their approach runs. The tactical edge that had carried Japan from victory to victory across 6 months of warfare was slipping away with each passing minute. Nagumo's hesitation had created a window of vulnerability that the Americans were about to exploit with devastating effect. Commander John Waldron banked his Douglas TBD Devastator into its final approach run. The Japanese carrier fleet spread out below him like pieces on a tactical board. It was 10:15 on the morning of June 4th, and Torpedo Squadron 8 had found the enemy exactly where intelligence had predicted they would be. 15 aircraft flying in perfect formation, their Mark 13 torpedoes armed and ready, represented the first American strike to reach the Japanese carriers. Waldron keyed his radio microphone for what he knew would be his final transmission. "Attack immediately. We will attack. Good luck." The squadron commander had trained his pilots for this moment through months of intensive preparation. knowing that torpedo attacks against defended carriers were tantamount to suicide missions. Yet duty demanded they press home their attack regardless of casualties. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol reacted with lethal efficiency. Lieutenant Shigematsu Sakai led his section of Zeros into a diving attack on the American formation, his machine, guns chattering as tracers reached out toward the lumbering torpedo bombers. The Devastators, designed in the early 1930s, were helplessly outmatched by the agile Japanese fighters. One by one, Waldron's aircraft fell into the sea. Ensign George Gay watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him, their aircraft breaking apart under the concentrated fire of the Zero fighters. His own plane, riddled with bullets and losing altitude, managed to release its torpedo before crashing into the Pacific. Gay would be the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice. Minutes later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise arrived to repeat the same doomed attack. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led his 14 aircraft in a desperate charge against the Kaga, their pilots knowing full well the fate that awaited them. The Japanese fighters fell upon them with renewed fury, shooting down 10 of the 14 attackers before they could reach torpedo release position. The 3rd Torpedo Squadron to attack, VT-3 from the Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, faced the same reception. Japanese anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks decimated the formation, leaving only 5 of 12 aircraft to return to their carrier. Not a single American torpedo found its target during the entire morning's attacks. From the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched the slaughter with grim satisfaction. The American attacks appeared desperate and poorly coordinated, confirming his assessment that the enemy lacked both the tactical skill and equipment to challenge Japanese naval superiority. His fighters had performed magnificently, destroying nearly 40 American aircraft with minimal losses. As documented in official Japanese action reports, the morning's defensive success seemed to vindicate their tactical doctrines. The vaunted American carrier force appeared to be committing suicide in piecemeal attacks that accomplished nothing beyond the wasteful sacrifice of pilots and aircraft. Nagumo felt his confidence returning as he watched the last American torpedo bomber disappear beneath the waves. What the Japanese admiral failed to recognize was that the torpedo attacks, despite their apparent failure, had accomplished a crucial tactical objective. The low-flying American aircraft had drawn the entire Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches completely undefended. Zero fighters, their fuel depleted by continuous combat, landed aboard their carriers to refuel and rearm. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading dive bombers from the Enterprise, watched the final torpedo attack from 30,000 feet above the Japanese fleet. His scout-bombing Squadron 6 had been searching for the enemy carriers for over 2 hours, their fuel gauges approaching the point of no return. The sight of burning American aircraft below filled him with rage and determination. Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, made the tactical decision that would change the course of the Pacific War. Instead of coordinating with the torpedo squadrons as originally planned, he would attack immediately while the Japanese fighters remained at low altitude. His 37 dive bombers began their attack runs at precisely 10:22, their target the carrier Kaga. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had not been in vain. Their deaths had created the window of opportunity that American dive bombers needed to strike at the heart of Japanese naval power. The tactical edge that had protected Japanese carriers throughout their string of victories was about to vanish in a matter of minutes. Lieutenant Richard Best pushed his Douglas SBD Dauntless into a screaming dive, the carrier Akagi growing larger in his bomb sight with each passing second. At 10:24 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the fate of the Pacific War balanced on the wings of American dive bombers attacking from 3,500 feet. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol remained at low altitude, still engaged with the remnants of the torpedo squadrons, leaving the sky above their carriers completely undefended. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck the Akagi just aft of the bridge, penetrating the flight deck before exploding among aircraft being refueled and rearmed in the hangar bay below. The secondary explosions that followed were catastrophic. Aviation fuel ignited in rolling fireballs that swept through the ship's interior, while bombs and torpedoes detonated in chain reactions that tore apart the carrier's vitals. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Bombing Squadron 3 from the Yorktown in their attack on the Soryu. Leslie's bomb struck the carrier's forward flight deck, instantly transforming the ship into a blazing inferno. Within minutes, fires reached the aviation fuel storage areas, creating explosions that could be heard 20 miles away. The Kaga suffered perhaps the most devastating attack of all. Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from the Enterprise scored multiple hits along the length of the flight deck, igniting aircraft that had been spotted for takeoff. Captain Jisaku Okada watched in horror as his ship transformed from a proud carrier into a floating crematorium within moments. Admiral Nagumo, thrown to the deck of the Akagi's bridge by the force of the explosion, struggled to comprehend the disaster unfolding around him. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of his 4 fleet carriers had been reduced to burning wrecks. The tactical edge that had seemed so secure just moments before had evaporated in the face of perfectly timed American attacks. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from surgery in the Akagi's sick bay, felt the ship shudder as bombs struck home. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood immediately that Japan's naval supremacy in the Pacific had just been shattered by the very enemy they had thought defeated. "The Americans have learned well," he whispered to himself as smoke filled the compartment. As recorded in the official action report of Vice Admiral William Halsey, who was monitoring the battle from his hospital bed, the coordinated dive bomber, attacks represented the finest achievement of American naval aviation up to that point in the war. Years of training and tactical development had culminated in this moment of perfect execution. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu refused to abandon his ship, choosing to go down with his command in accordance with the ancient traditions of the Imperial Navy. His sacrifice was repeated across the Japanese fleet as hundreds of sailors died at their posts, trapped below decks by fires that made escape impossible. The sole surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, immediately began preparing a counterstrike. Captain Tomeo Kaku ordered every available aircraft armed and launched against the American fleet. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters took off at 11:05, determined to exact revenge for their sister ships. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the Hiryu's strike force toward the coordinates of the American carriers, his pilots burning with fury over the destruction they had witnessed. The Japanese Navy's tactical doctrine called for immediate retaliation against enemy forces, and these aviators intended to demonstrate that Japan retained the capability to strike back. But the mathematics of carrier warfare had fundamentally shifted. Where 4 Japanese carriers had controlled the morning sky, only 1 remained operational. The American force, despite its losses, still possessed 3 functioning flight decks and the initiative that comes with successful attack. The tactical balance that had favored Japan since Pearl Harbor had reversed in those crucial 5 minutes. Aboard the Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance received damage reports from his strike aircraft with quiet satisfaction. The enemy fleet that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months lay burning on the horizon, its power broken by American courage and tactical innovation. The trap had been sprung with devastating effectiveness. The rising sun was setting on Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. The sun climbed toward its zenith on June 4, 1942, as the full scope of the Japanese disaster became clear across the burning fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, received the devastating reports with stoic acceptance. In a single morning, the combined fleet had lost 3/4 of its carrier strength, and the irreplaceable pilots who had carried Japan to victory after victory. Captain Tomeo Kaku stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, watching columns of smoke rise from his sister ships on the horizon. His aircraft had successfully attacked the Yorktown, scoring 3 bomb hits that forced the American carrier to dead stop. But one carrier damaged could not balance the loss of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The tactical mathematics of the battle had shifted irrevocably against Japan. At 2:31 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch led the final American strike against the Hiryu. 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown began their attack runs on the last Japanese carrier, their pilots grimly determined to complete the destruction of Nagumo's once invincible fleet. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, reduced to a handful of fighters, fought desperately to protect their final ship. 4 bombs struck the Hiryu in quick succession, transforming the carrier into the same blazing wreck as her sisters. Captain Kaku, facing the inevitable, ordered his crew to abandon ship before joining the ancient tradition of going down with his command. By 5 in the evening, all 4 Japanese carriers had either sunk or been abandoned as hopeless wrecks. The tactical edge that had carried Japan across the Pacific was burning on the bottom of the sea, along with the irreplaceable pilots who had made victory possible. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the leader of the morning's Midway strike, was among the hundreds of aviators who died with their ships. These veterans of the China War and the Pearl Harbor attack could not be replaced by Japan's limited training infrastructure. Admiral Chester Nimitz, monitoring the battle from Pearl Harbor, recognized immediately that the tide of the Pacific War had turned. The Japanese fleet that had seemed invincible just hours before now lay scattered across the ocean floor. American naval intelligence had achieved its greatest triumph, providing the tactical advantage necessary to defeat a superior enemy force through superior positioning and timing. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his code breakers at Station Hypo had delivered the gift of foreknowledge that made victory possible. Their months of patient work deciphering Japanese naval codes had provided American commanders with the enemy's complete battle plan, allowing them to position their forces for maximum advantage. The trap had been as much an intelligence victory as a tactical one. As detailed in post-war analyses conducted by the Naval War College, the Battle of Midway marked the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced air groups crippled Japan's ability to project power across the vast ocean distances that had seemed their natural domain. The human cost of the Japanese defeat was staggering. Over 3,000 sailors and airmen died with their ships, including many of the veteran pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. American casualties, while significant, were a fraction of Japanese losses. 307 killed, including the heroic crews of the torpedo squadrons whose sacrifice had made victory possible. Emperor Hirohito, upon learning of the disaster, understood that Japan's war aims had become impossible to achieve. The decisive battle that Admiral Yamamoto had sought to force upon the Americans had indeed been fought, but the result was the opposite of what Japanese planners had envisioned. Thus, tactical edge that had vanished at Midway would never be recovered. From this moment forward, American industrial might and tactical innovation would drive Japanese forces back across the Pacific, island by island, until the rising sun flag was hauled down from the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay 3 years later. The trap had been perfectly executed, and with it, the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire.